This is France, the second largest economy in mainland Europe and a regional centre of finance, manufacturing and highly value-adding industries like high-end tourism, fashion, nuclear energy and education. France is home to 31 of the world's biggest 500 companies, and they're all in industries that operate around the globe to bring foreign income back to the country. France has a lot going for it, and that's why it's one of the oldest advanced economies in the world, having effectively been one of the first countries to start the Industrial Revolution. But for all of its successes, you wouldn't realise it if you were transported to its capital city streets, which are now overflowing with uncollected garbage, lined with police, and surrounded by boarded up shops that have had to close down. Civil unrest started in January to demonstrate opposition to a bill that increased the age a French citizen could retire from 62 to 64. The demonstrations eventually turned into strikes involving a broad range of workers, including energy grid operators, teachers, public transport drivers, dock workers, and garbage collection personnel. These essential workers striking has effectively ground the French economy to a halt, as a lot of its essential industries, even the ones that don't directly employ the people demonstrating, can't operate without these public functions in place. The average tourist isn't going to want to visit Paris when they're reading reports about violent demonstrations, tear gas, and all the attractions that they wanted to see being shut down. These demonstrations, whether you agree with them or not, are ultimately just a very visible result of an interesting debate over an economic problem that all countries are going to have to come up with an answer to in the next few decades. Unfortunately for France, this debate has been had very passionately at a time when the economy can least afford it. National debt to GDP is approaching 100%, which, while not out of the ordinary for advanced economies like France, will still be a major burden on their economy as interest rates rise, especially if the problems disrupt their historic sources of foreign income. So, what is the economic argument for and against these demonstrations? What can we learn from France's problems that relate to our own economies? And finally, does this have the potential to kick off another Eurozone crisis? After we've done all of that, we can put France on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. This episode of Economics Explained was brought to you by Public.com. Public has been a long-term sponsor of this channel, and I'm proud to be able to work with them because their platform makes investing as easy as possible for anybody to get started. Public just launched Treasury accounts, a new way for you to access US Treasuries directly on your phone. Unlike a traditional savings or high-yield savings account, the yield that you get with Treasury bills is a fixed rate, so the rate that you get at the time of purchase won't fluctuate. You also don't need to deal with the complications of buying US Treasuries, either from a bank or navigating through a government website that looks like it was designed in 1996. Public also has a feature that lets you automatically reinvest your Treasury bills at maturity, so that you don't have to do anything to remain invested in T-bills, hassle-free. Their platform is simple to use, fully regulated and SIPC insured. They also don't accept payment for order flow, which is how other commission-free brokerages make their money by selling your trade data or redirecting your orders through third parties. Go to public.com/EE to start getting a yield on your cash backed by the US government, or by following the link in the video description below. At its core, these demonstrations are about different solutions to the economic problem of worker productivity. For any economy to function, it needs the factors of production: land, capital, and labour. It's possible that in the future, developments in automation and artificial intelligence will comprehensively replace the role of people in all parts of the economy, but it's not likely to happen as quickly as most people think. Robots and AI programs like ChatGPT are just part of what economists call capital, and capital is anything that helps people produce more stuff. A worker's tools are capital, a shipping port is capital, and even people's homes, by some economists' definitions, would be capital because they give workers a place to rest and get ready to produce more stuff. Even the most impressive things that AI can do at the moment is only a small part of everything that needs to be done in a well-functioning economy. An AI might be able to design a house that looks nice, but it still needs humans to do everything else, including double-check its work, actually building the house, and instructing the AI to design the house based on a set of instructions that a human provides in the first place. One day, all of these may just happen automatically, but until then, artificial intelligence is just a tool that leverages the work of humans to make more stuff. No different from a hammer or any other piece of capital. France has struggled to adopt technical infrastructure into their highly technical industries and have relied more on labour than capital when compared to other economies in the region, particularly Germany. That is a problem for France because their population is getting older and spending more time in retirement, putting a greater burden on younger workers. This happens either directly through higher taxes that need to be paid by those that are still working to provide public services to those that are too old, or indirectly by unproductive members of society still consuming an economy's resources but providing nothing in return. As people live longer on average, they will spend a greater portion of their lives being net economic burdens than net economic providers. And I know it sounds terrible to refer to someone's existence as a burden, but sometimes economists can be a little bit heartless for the sake of aggregate simplicity. Now, we've explored similar problems to this in just the past few months with our videos on South Korea and the economic impacts of brain drain. But France is a little bit different because it actually has a very healthy birth rate of 1.81 children per woman on average, which means it's almost sustaining its population even before immigration, which it also has a lot of. Compare this to South Korea, which only has a birth rate of 0.84 children per woman on average and has much lower levels of young immigrants moving into the country to replace people as they get too old to work. South Korea and a lot of other countries, even in Europe for that matter, have less young people entering their workforce to replace old people, so the issue of ageing populations is more serious there than it is in France, at least on a macroeconomic level. But despite the relatively comfortable position they find themselves in, the French government has taken emergency action to push through retirement reforms that are clearly wildly unpopular with a large part of the French public. While making this video, we were lucky enough to consult directly with Tomasz Mikalski, an economics professor from HEC Paris who not only offered insights into the French economy, but also the experience of a French professional living and working in Paris.
There is no sense of urgency for this pension reform, even now among the government that tried to push it forward. Everybody knew the system for a couple of more years is more or less in balance. At the end of the day, we will need to have an increase in the retirement age, some major adjustments. It doesn't have to be now, right? That's a different story, and that's why also the rioters or labor unions that protest, they know this. This is not something that if we don't reform today, we're staring down the abyss, right? It's not, or we have a default, or a drastic adjustment of pensions now, or even 5 years from now. That's not the case, and that's also one of the problems why the protests are so vehement, because they know it's not really a necessity.
Some political commentators are even suggesting that this could cost the French government re-election, which means that this is not a decision that they would have made lightly. So, why is this so important for France? For starters, controlling the working population is an important issue for all countries, especially advanced economies with low birth rates. It's not even just when people exit the workforce that is becoming a problem. More and more people are entering the workforce later in life because they are spending longer at school and university before getting their first full-time job. Higher levels of education normally make workers more productive because their education should allow them to leverage other factors of production to produce more value for a given hour of work. If someone goes to university to become an engineer, they might design an automated ship loading and unloading machine that produces more economic value overall than someone who just gets a job as a dock worker. Of course, this is a very oversimplified example, but it displays a fundamental rule of economics, which is that to achieve economic growth long term, a nation needs more land, more capital, or more labour. All the land on Earth is pretty much accounted for these days, and as Russia is currently finding out, taking new territory by force is difficult and economically damaging. That leaves the options for economic growth exclusively with improving labour and capital. Having more capital can either mean investing in more machinery and tools and technology, or developing better stuff. A farmer with a state-of-the-art combine harvester can produce a lot more food than a farmer with a horse-drawn plough. Improving labour means getting more people to work, getting them to work harder, or getting them to work for longer. This means that developing technology is normally the best long-term solution to improving overall living conditions, because it's no good achieving economic growth and prosperity and having a fantastic GDP number if it's only achieved by everybody in the country working themselves to death. Again, on a macroeconomic level at least, this still looks very good for France. Surprisingly, the country actually has a higher labour force participation rate than even the workaholics in the USA. 73% of French residents between the ages of 15 and 65 work, where only 63% of US residents do. France, despite its reputation for having lazy workers, actually has one of the highest labour force participation rates of any advanced economy in the world. So, if all of the macroeconomic metrics are looking so good for France, then why is it the first developed country that is having such visible reactions to issues that other countries have much worse? Well, it's actually the relative strength of their labour force that is letting this happen. The French have very strong worker protections, which is why they demonstrate so much without losing their jobs. A higher rate of French residents work, but they on average work for fewer hours because the country has a culture of pushing for work-life balance over the other option of working people as hard as they possibly can to maximise economic output. Those worker protections also extend to long-term benefits like pensions, which fund the retirement of most French workers. These benefits, combined with the flexibility of working in France, explains why such a high percentage of the country actively participates in the labour market, and it also explains why funding pensions is going to be such a problem. And that's because so many people are going to be eligible for them, and they are quite generous compared to most other economies. The French pension system falls into 3 pillars. The non-contributory minimum pension is a small amount paid to French residents over the age of 65 who don't have enough assets or income to support themselves. The payment for this type of pension is less than €1,000 a month and is funded by the French government. The second pillar is voluntary private provisions, where people can save their own money in tax-free accounts for retirement, kind of like superannuation or 401ks in other countries. The third pillar is the one that is causing these riots, and that is the mandatory pension provisions, which is something that both employers and employees are forced to contribute payroll taxes towards. The money from this scheme is invested and paid back to workers once they reach retirement age, and it aims to give workers between 70% and 80% of the income they were making during their 25 highest earning working years. Increasing the age at which people become eligible for these pensions not only keeps them contributing to the economy and paying the contribution taxes for a little bit longer, but it also reduces the amount of time the average person will be receiving those benefits, helping to make the program more sustainable in the long term as people continue to start working later and living longer. Now, this makes economic sense, but it's also easy to see why people are angry. This is money that was paid by workers directly through their taxes for their entire lives, and now the government is changing the rules about when they can access it. So, if people are this unhappy about it, what are the alternatives? Schemes like this can be very clever, but they can't get around the basic macroeconomic fact that less people contributing to an economy and more people being a burden on that economy is going to need to be paid for somewhere. Raising retirement ages is one solution, although that one has obviously been very unpopular. Another option is to reduce the amount that these pensions pay out, although that's also likely to be very unpopular as well. The government could push more people to utilise voluntary retirement plans, but for a lot of people that are already old, it's too late for them to start now when they've been expecting to receive a pension for their entire life. The last option is to increase the payroll taxes paid by workers and businesses in the economy so that there is more money going into the system to cover a growing number of people that will be dependent on it as more and more French workers retire. This is what most organised movements have been asking for, but there is still an economic trade-off. Labour force participation in France is very high, but so is unemployment. That's because once people find jobs, it's very hard to get rid of them because of all of the workers' protections. That's great for the people that already have jobs, but it can make finding work a lot harder because businesses are very careful about who they hire because they know it's very hard to get rid of a bad employee. Adding the additional expense of higher payroll taxes will make French workers even less attractive, and because France is a member of the EU, a lot of businesses have the option of easily hiring someone from another country. France also has a problem with brain drain amongst its most productive workers, who don't really benefit from worker protections, but do get hurt by labour market rigidities and higher taxes that are needed to maintain the protections given to average French workers. A French worker in an in-demand role can normally earn a lot more by moving to a neighbouring EU country, which not only denies France their taxes to fund pension schemes, but it also denies the country their economic productivity. It's a difficult problem, and there is no solution that will make everybody happy. The study of economics itself is just trying to answer the central economic problem, which is that people have unlimited desires but only limited resources in which to fulfill those desires. People would love to spend as long as they possibly can receiving a pension, but somewhere in the economic system, someone has to provide the resources to make that possible. The question of who pays and who receives is always going to be up for debate. And the people of France are fortunate in the sense that they are able to participate in that debate so openly. Unfortunately, this is also happening at a time when France can least afford it. France's debt burden is becoming a problem. Historically, it's been able to service high levels of debt thanks to the foreign income it receives from all of its multinational corporations and the millions of tourists it receives every year. Now those industries are in trouble because French exports tend to be luxury items that are more expensive than similar goods made in other countries. During strong economic times, this is great because the country can add significant economic value to its goods and services just by putting a Made in France sticker on things. But with all of the uncertainty in the global economy, consumers are spending less on luxuries and businesses are investing less into the high-tech equipment that France also produces a lot of. People who are planning their first holiday in years are also choosing to give France a miss because the news is filled with images of garbage piling up in the streets, which is not exactly what people want to see when they're visiting the City of Love. Despite these challenges, most economists are not particularly worried about the fallout of these riots as much as they are worried about the economic problems they represent.
Even the most spectacular closure of the French economy in 1995, when you had 3 weeks of a total stalemate, a total closure of the country, was a shutdown. That cost the economy 0.2% of GDP. That's not what's happening now. The effects of the strikes would be much order of magnitude probably lower than that. Riots are peanuts, in fact. Of course, except for those who are directly affected, the shopkeepers, the restaurants, and then they're really very localized.
Brain drain of young workers and the country's struggle to properly implement technology are going to be a much larger problem for the French economy than even prolonged protests. Nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but lower foreign income combined with higher repayments on a debt burden that is approaching 100% of the country's GDP has a lot of people concerned that the second largest economy in Europe could trigger yet another debt crisis. Okay, now it's time to put France on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. Starting with size, France is the 7th largest economy in the world, only just falling behind India, that has a population more than 20 times larger. With a GDP of $2.9 trillion, it gets a 9 out of 10. That figure is spread out over a population of just 67 million people, which means despite all of its challenges and its reputation for having lazy workers, it still has one of the most productive populations in the world. It has a GDP per capita of $43,659 as of 2021, which is slightly behind its European peers of Germany and the UK, but still makes it well and truly a high-income country, so it gets an 8 out of 10. Stability and confidence is strong. France is a major, long-standing, well-respected democracy with a robust legal system and well-regulated markets. The very fact that its people are so quick to protest changes that a lot of other people from a lot of other countries would just ignore is a great example of a healthy, functioning democracy. And while issues like this may cause economic challenges in the short term, they almost always provide better economic outcomes in the long term. France gets an 8 out of 10. Unfortunately, its economic growth has been stagnant over the past decade. The Eurozone crisis, the fallout from Brexit, which also impacted France as a major trading partner and transport channel, as well as COVID, have all put downwards pressure on France's economic growth. Since it didn't really grow at all, it gets a 2 out of 10. It would have actually needed to shrink to get anything lower than this. Finally, industry. France is a surprisingly industrious nation. It builds everything from aircraft and cars to handcrafted luxury fashion pieces. It is also a major service centre, tourist destination and innovation hotspot. It's a world leader in everything from nuclear energy and pharmaceuticals to creams that you rub on your face to look younger. France gets an 8 out of 10. Altogether, that gives France an average score of 7.2 out of 10, which puts it up here on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. Our entire interview with Thomas Michalski is available on the Economics Explained Spotify page, where you can also find ad-free and audio-only versions of all of these videos, as well as interviews we've done with other world-leading economists. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.